Welcome to the show. I'm Eddy Kara. I cover film and Canadian politics the way a psychologist would. And this is episode 204 of Real Talk with Eddy Kara. And it is called Canada's on Fire. The opposition's tangled in its own web. Carney's winning by Grand Canyon, and so is Spider-Man. So let's do a roll call of everyone having a worse week than you. Alberta's premier is threatening to enforce the law against the province's own First Nations over a vote on leaving the country their treaties are with. British Columbia's on fire. Pierre Poilievre is at war with his own party. And Doug Ford has hit that special stage of scandal where nobody can remember which one is the jet and which one is the $300 million loan anymore. Because at this point, it's not just 4 stories. It's one story wearing 4 outfits. Mark Carney, meanwhile, is sitting at 66% doing absolutely nothing except not being any of those guys. So welcome to episode 204. Let's get started. Stick around because we're actually ending on a good note. My genuinely positive Eddy's Final Cut review of Spider-Man Brand New Day. Because after 5 segments of Canadian political chaos, we all deserve a movie that doesn't make us angry. So let's get into it. Alberta and the Reckoning Nobody's schedule. Premier Danielle Smith is holding a referendum on October 19th of this year. Question 10 asks Albertans whether the province should start the legal process toward a future binding vote on separation. Not the separation itself, just a question whether to hold it. She says she personally supports staying in Canada. She also is the one who scheduled the vote on leaving it. Here's what should be leading every newscast in this country. Danielle Smith was asked directly what happens if First Nations communities engage in civil disobedience over this referendum. And she said, sit with this, that the law will be enforced. Not, we'll sit down and let's talk, we'll sort it out, or not even, we understand the concern. The law will be enforced. Against the people whose treaties predate Alberta's existence as a province, by the way. Over a vote about whether Alberta gets to leave the country those treaties were signed with. She's threatening law enforcement against the original signatories of this land over a referendum on leaving the country their treaties are with. Try saying that sentence twice. 10 questions. 9 were already controversial. Immigration, election security, constitutional grievances. On May 21st, Smith also added the 10th question. Alberta should remain a province of Canada versus starting the legal process toward a future binding vote to leave. It's non-binding. She's called 50% plus 1 the threshold. Angus Reid has 60% of Albertans saying they'd vote no to the actual question. 67% wanting to stay in a simpler hypothetical. And 51% saying that the official question is just plain too confusing. And that confusion isn't a drafting accident. Cyclins, group identity theory. This isn't primarily a policy story. It's a group identity threat story. When a group's identity feels threatened, people stop doing cost-benefit math and start doing loyalty math. Alberta has real grievances, such as equalization, pipelines, energy policy that feels designed in Toronto and not Alberta. Smith translated those policy grievances into an identity grievance. Let's reform equalization suddenly became, they don't respect who we are. You can argue with a policy, but keep in mind, you cannot argue with someone else's sense of who they are. And that's the whole play. And it's why 56% of Albertans say she's handled this poorly. Yet she keeps going anyway. At an unrelated news conference at Calgary Airport in June, Smith was asked what happens if First Nations engage in civil disobedience. Her answer, "I hope it doesn't come to that." Then she pointed straight at Alberta's Critical Infrastructure Defence Act, the law that penalizes people who block railways, highways, even pipelines, and actually said, quote, "I think you saw how serious we are about enforcing that law as we have many times over previous years." That's not hypothetical. That's a premier pointing at a statute with real penalties and saying, "Try us." Treaty 8 Grand Chief Trevor Mercredi didn't blink when he said, quote, "There can be no decisions about Alberta separating without consultation and consent of our First Nations." He said if it comes to it, they'll get in the way of the industry, taking it to the highways. Smith says this referendum doesn't trigger the duty to consult. Mercredi says any decision that could lead to separation absolutely triggers it. That's not just a small disagreement, by the way. That's two sides who don't even agree the Crown's oldest legal obligations that still apply here. Cyclens, procedural justice weaponized in reverse. People don't just want a fair outcome. They want a fair process, a real seat at the table before any decision is made. Smith isn't skipping the process by accident. She's decided that the process doesn't apply at all to this decision. That's not a legitimacy gap. That's a legitimacy refusal. And refusals don't get repaired with just a press release. Cyclens, reactance theory. When people feel a right is being taken from them, they push back even harder, never quieter. The law will be enforced isn't a neutral statement to a population who's already been watching its consultation rights get waved away. It confirms pushing back is the only lever left. And threatening enforcement before anyone's broken any law whatsoever is a pretty efficient way to guarantee it happens. This story was never really about October 19th. It's about whether a government gets to treat its oldest legal relationships in this country as an inconvenience to a ballot question, and whether the law will be enforced comment is a threat you make to your own population or to the people your government's power originates from in the first place. Danielle Smith didn't invent that tension, but she is right now choosing exactly how to handle it. And so far the answer is with a statute number and a straight face. From constitutional brinksmanship in Alberta to a province that's actually on fire. So without further ado, let's head to British Columbia. BC is burning and somehow it's our fault. David Eby's worst week and Trump's weirdest grievance just yet. Over 20,000 people forced from their homes, the largest evacuation in British Columbia history. Homes lost. A firefighting official described the Bald Range fire near Summerland as being like a bomb going off, and Premier David Eby had to declare a provincial state of emergency, one of the only times in BC history that's happened specifically because of wildfires. This is a real crisis with real families who are in real danger. So let's start there before we get to the point that's going to make you want to throw something. What actually happened? The Bald Range wildfire discovered near Summerland nearly doubled in size overnight, forcing evacuations across Summerland and Peachland. About 20,000 people combined in the heart of BC's wine country. Air evacuations were underway for people trapped behind the fire perimeter. As of the emergency declaration, the province was tracking over 100 active wildfires. Eddy toured evacuation centers, met with evacuees, and most notably, said he'd actually been reluctant to declare the emergency because he was worried about desensitizing the public to future warnings, given how often BC now has to make this call. That's worth sitting with for a second. A premier hesitating to sound the alarm because the alarm has gone off so many times before that people might stop listening. That's not a leadership failure. That's a decade of accelerating climate disasters doing to the entire concept of emergency messaging. Cyclones, alarm fatigue. Alarm fatigue is a documented phenomenon in high-stakes fields such as hospitals, emergency management, aviation, where repeated high-urgency warnings cause people to become desensitized and respond much more slowly over time. Eddy naming that risk out loud before declaring the emergency anyway does not mean it's indecision. It's a leader doing a real-time risk calculus about the warning system itself, and not just the fire. And then Trump made it about himself. Here's where this segment turns from tragedy to farce. As smoke from close to 1,000 Canadian wildfires drifted into the American Midwest and East Coast, hazing skies in Chicago, Washington, New York, and Detroit, Donald Trump didn't offer any condolences whatsoever. Instead, he threatened with tariffs. His actual words on Truth Social were, quote, "We are holding Canada responsible for the fact they are not properly maintaining their forests and brush therein, and the United States is being unnecessarily invaded by filthy, polluted, and unhealthy air, the quality of which is dangerous and totally unacceptable." He also later told reporters he'd raised this issue directly with Carney at the World Cup final. Quote, "I told him, you gotta stop these fires from coming in and poisoning our air. If we can help them, we'll help them. But maybe they should pay us some damages or something, or we should do some tariffs." Let's be extremely clear about what's happening here. A country is on fire. People have lost their homes, and the response from our southern neighbor is a bill. Somewhere in Ontario, a family is watching their house burn down. And somewhere in Washington, a man is deciding whether to invoice them for the smoke. The part that's actually quite true. Scientists on both sides of the border pushed back immediately. Wildfire researchers pointed out that Canada's boreal forests, dominated by spruce, fir, and spongy moss-covered soil that's normally waterlogged, aren't the kind of forest that responds to the clean-out brush approach Trump keeps invoking. In hot, dry conditions, the forest floor itself becomes flammable regardless of how it's maintained. One climate scientist called it plainly, quote, "It's weak leadership to blame someone when disasters are happening." There is also an inconvenient math problem for Trump's framing. The US has emitted more cumulative fossil carbon dioxide than any country on Earth. Even Doug Ford, not exactly known for picking fights with Trump, by the way, pushed back, noting Canadian crews helped fight wildfires in California just last year and never got reciprocal help in return. Carney, for his part, brushed off the criticism in French at a presser, noting that fighting climate change is, quote, "the responsibility of all countries, including the United States." Cyclones, scapegoating under external threat. When people face a threat too large and diffuse the control like climate-driven disaster, there's a well-documented psychological pull toward assigning it a simple yet controllable villain instead. A wildfire caused by heat, drought, and decades of accumulated emissions is genuinely hard to blame anyone. A neighboring country is easy. Trump isn't engaging with the actual mechanism of the fires. He's outsourcing an uncomfortable, uncontrollable problem onto a scapegoat he can tariff. Here's what I want you to sit with. British Columbia had its worst wildfire week in provincial history. Real people lost their homes, and the loudest voice from the South is not even offering any resources to help. Ford even noted Canada has already sent help to the United States before, many, many times, unreciprocated. It was pricing out a punishment. David Eby is managing an actual emergency, with actual constraints and actual hesitation about how to communicate it honestly. Donald Trump, however, is managing a grievance. Only one of those is leadership. From a crisis nobody in Ottawa asked for, to a number Mark Carney absolutely did nothing to expect, this early in his tenure, 66%. Let's talk about the most popular man in Canadian politics, being, of all things, a former banker, after this short break. The most popular man in Canadian politics is a guy who used to run central banks for a living. Mark Carney, a man whose entire public persona before politics was reassuringly boring central banker, is sitting at a 66% approval rating. According to Spark Insights, that ties him with Jean Chrétien in December 1994. For one of the highest approval ratings ever recorded in this country. Jean Chrétien, December 1994. A man who once physically choke-slammed a protester, had a pie slammed on his face, stood up to George W. Bush with regard to the Iraq War, and Canadians loved him more for it. Mark Carney's version of that same energy is calmly explaining monetary policy while wearing a suit that actually costs more than my car. 2 out of 3 Canadians currently approve of a man whose personality, literally by his own admission, by the way, is roughly the temperature of a filing cabinet. Something is definitely going on here. Other trackers put him lower. Liaison Strategies has him in mid to high 50s through the summer. Abacus has the government above 50%, with half of Canadians holding a positive personal impression of him. The exact number moves depending on who's asking, but every tracker agrees on the shape. Carney is comfortably, durably popular, and Pierre Poilievre is not. Now, worth noting, it wasn't always this smooth for Mark Carney. He did dip into the high 40s last October amid the pre-budget tensions and the cabinet turbulence, and actually then climbed back. Now, this isn't a guy who's never had a bad month. It's a guy whose bad months bottom out where most leaders would consider a great year. Cyclens. The halo effect reversed. Now, the halo effect is when one strong trait colors how people judge everything else about that person. Normally, that trait is charisma. Carney has almost none of the traditional markers. Instead, what he has is a resume that screams adult supervision during a genuine global instability. Competence itself became the charisma. The halo isn't on the personality. It's on his job title, and it's covering for everything else. Now, I know what you're thinking. Where is this approval hike coming from? Well, here's the number that should worry the conservative war room. 2/3 of Bloc Québécois voters and 70% of NDP voters approve of the Carney government. Even a real slice of 2025 conservative voters, high 30% in some surveys, by the way, say the exact same. That's not consolidation of the base. That's cross-coalition borrowing. And it's actually the hardest thing to build in politics. Cyclens. Source credibility theory. A message lands harder from a source seen as both expert and trustworthy. And that credibility can cross party lines in ways loyalties to the party never does. Now, a Bloc voter doesn't approve of Carney because they suddenly love federalism. They actually approve because his resume reads expert and his affect reads trustworthy. And that combination short-circuits the usual partisan filter. The part nobody says out loud. Pollsters keep noting Carney's approval is more attached to him personally, rather than him being the leader of the Liberal Party or the Liberal brand. That means an entire 66% is sitting on the guy's shoulders with no institutional backup plan. And its popularity that could evaporate the moment the steady hand story stops matching the headlines. 66% is a genuinely remarkable percentage for any modern Canadian Prime Minister. But it's not permanent. And Carney, a man who spent his career reading exactly this kind of instability for a living, knows better than anyone. The real question isn't whether he's popular right now. He clearly and obviously is. It's whether the popularity ever becomes something more durable than one man's personal credibility. Which brings us, conveniently, to the guy who should be closing that gap instead. Poilievre's friendly fire had to lose a winnable election without ever facing the other team. Now picture a hockey team down 3 goals in the third period. And now picture half that bench fighting each other on camera while the coach calls the guys who used to win them a lot of championships lobbyists from out east. That's not a metaphor, by the way. That's the Conservative Party of Canada during this summer of 2026. Pierre Poilievre is trailing in the polls and currently at war with the people who won 3 consecutive Ontario elections for his own movement. And by the way, you literally cannot write comedy this good. Calgary Stampede, July 3rd, 2026. Poilievre celebrates Carrie Lynn Finlay's win in the BC Conservative leadership race, framing it as, on camera at a public event, a win over Liberal lobbyists from out east. Here is the problem, though. Those people weren't Liberals. They were Corey Teneke, Nick Kouvalis, and Anthony Koch, some of the most accomplished and successful Conservative campaign operatives in the country. Teneke ran Doug Ford's last 3 provincial majority wins in Ontario. The leader of the federal Conservative Party looked at the architects of Ontario Conservative dominance and literally called them the enemy. And this was not in secret. It was in public, on tape. Cyclens. In-group, out-group misfire. In-group loyalty strengthens under threat, but only when the group correctly identifies who's outside of that group in the first place. Poilievre's line accidentally redrew his own coalition's boundary to exclude the people most responsible for its recent wins. Not just a messaging slip or a gaffe, by the way. It was a targeting error. Days of conservative on conservative crossfire followed. Columnist Brian Lilly published a piece literally asking in print whether Poilievre actually wants to be Prime Minister. Ben Woodfinden, a former Poilievre staffer himself, posted publicly that he's never been more depressed about the state of conservative politics in this country. And keep in mind, by the way, this guy's not a Liberal. He's an ex-Poilievre staffer, publicly about his own team. Every day this feud runs unresolved without Poilievre personally shutting it down. The exit gets way more expensive than the entrance would have actually been. Sunk cost, but make it a caucus. Analysis of nearly 30,000 Facebook posts from 120 Conservative MPs found that Pierre Poilievre's own name appearing in just 9.5% in caucus posts since the last election began, way down from 21% during the campaign itself. His own MPs, by the way, are quietly scrubbing him out of their content. And it's not accidental. It's actually intentional and not just vibes. 4 Conservative MPs, let's remember that they were Chris d'Entremont, Michael Ma, Matt Genereux, and Marilyn Gladu, crossed the floor to the Liberals between November of last year and April 2026. Caucus posting activity got cut roughly in half with each of those defections. Meanwhile, this is the part that should really sting, by the way, his base still loves him. It's everyone whose job is winning beyond the base who's the problem. Psych lens. Loss aversion, institutional addition. People feel losses roughly twice as intensely as equivalent gains. Each MP quietly distancing themselves to protect their own brand is individually, I guess, rational, and collectively, however, catastrophic. That gap has a name in game theory too. It's called a coordination failure. And coordination failures are exactly how governing parties turn into opposition parties. The Harper lesson no one's learning. From 1993 to 2003, the Canadian right was split, and the Liberals won 3 consecutive majorities with around 40% of the vote each time. Not because they were dominant, but because their opposition was busy fighting itself. What ended it wasn't one side proving the other was wrong. Stephen Harper put his rivals in his own cabinet and enforced one rule: fight Liberals, but not each other. And because of that, he won 3 elections. The counterexample is also right there too with Jason Kenney, who led a war with his own base consume his premiership. The base won the war and eventually lost the premier. There's no version of internal conservative warfare that ends well. There are only 2 versions: the one where the leader stops it early, and the one where it stops him. Now, Poilievre doesn't have a polling problem right now so much as a management problem. His base still loves him. His numbers against Carney, though, are stuck. And instead of closing that gap, he spent a chunk of the summer picking a fight with the guys who actually know how to win in Ontario, and more than once, by the way. And that's the exact province that decided the last 2025 election also. The leader's job is to be the one person whose responsibility is the coalition itself. When the leader picks the fight, it's not a fight. It's actually a fracture. Speaking of things that keep crashing back to earth, let's go back to Queen's Park, where Doug Ford's jet saga has a sequel no one's actually asked for, and where his own polling numbers have taken a massive hit, almost as steep as his aircraft's resale value. Quick update on Doug Ford, because a lot of things have happened, and none of it individually sounds that bad, and that's actually the problem. He bought a jet and sold it back days later at a loss. He rewrote the Freedom of Information law so nobody can see through his phone records. He loaned $300 million in public money to a private equity fund run by a cannabis entrepreneur to buy up unsold condos. And he gave himself until 2030 before he has to face voters again, without saying when exactly that election is actually happening. None of these are the same scandal, by the way. All of them feel like the same scandal. Here's a quick recap on the jet gravy scandal. The purchase, a pre-owned 2016 Bombardier Challenger 650, which cost $28.9 million, was finalized very quietly and revealed on a Friday. The opposition immediately dubbed it the gravy plane, which was quite embarrassing. By Sunday, Ford was walking it back. By Wednesday, it was sold, handed straight back to Bombardier for, in Ford's words, quote, the exact same price, no one lost anything. Except that was not quite true. The province later confirmed $191,000 in extra sunk costs from the brief ownership window. And by the way, for more on this, check out our previous podcast episode 202. Now, that's not just a scandal. That's actually a return policy. Now, the part that's actually the story about the election law. Here's what's easy to miss underneath the jet jokes. Back on October 27, 2025, Doug Ford's government proposed scrapping Ontario's fixed election date law entirely, calling it American style, and in Ford's own words, a, quote, fake law. And then the province repealed it on November 27, 2025. Now, under the old fixed date system, the next Ontario election would have been due by 2029. Under the new rules, no fixed date, up to 5 years between elections, and the next scheduled vote is now tentatively set for April 11, 2030. Unless Ford calls an early election himself, which, worth remembering by the way, he's already done before, literally just last year in February. So, the same government that just spent months bleeding approval points over jet purchase also handled itself the legal flexibility to avoid facing voters for up to 5 years instead of the usual 4. I'll let you draw your own conclusions about the timing. Cyclens. Accountability avoidance through structural change. Leaders facing declining trust don't always fix the underlying problem. Sometimes they just change the mechanism that would force a reckoning. Now, removing a fixed election date doesn't address why the approval collapsed in the first place. It moves the deadline for having to answer for it. And that's not governance. That's actually stalling with extra steps. Now, this is where it gets genuinely brutal for Doug Ford. Angus Reid clocked a 10-point drop in his approval between March and June alone, landing him at just 21%. Liaison Strategies had him even lower by late July, 24%, with 68 to 72% disapproving, depending on the week. And the Ontario Liberals actually leading the PCs in voter support for the first time since Liaison started tracking. Abacus found the PC slipping too, though calling the overall damage, quote, marginal rather than transformational. For now. And the driver isn't just the jet. There's also a hotel expense scandal, by the way, running in parallel. Toronto area MPPs charging thousands in hotel costs while working in their own city, by the way. That's compounding the damage even more. Even with all of that, by the way, 57% still see Ford as, quote, strong and decisive. So this isn't a guy who's lost his brand entirely. It's rather a guy whose brand of strength is increasingly reading as strong-arming taxpayers and definitely not a strong leader. The one thing Trump's actually done for Canada. In fairness, Doug Ford's one genuine silver lining in the tariff war was when he forced urgency on interprovincial trade. Now, for years, provinces have talked about tearing down the internal trade barriers, which is the patchwork of rules that makes it a lot harder to ship a product from, let's say, Quebec to Ontario than to Ohio. Ford's committed to removing those barriers, framing Trump's tariffs as the wake-up call Canada really needed. Doug Ford bought a jet nobody wanted, apologized for it nobody believed, and sold it at a taxpayer loss nobody's fully explained yet, and then gave himself until 2030 before he has to answer for any of it at the ballot box. That's either extremely lucky timing or extremely convenient timing. I'll let you decide which it is. We've had a constitutional crisis in Alberta, a province on fire in BC, a party who's at war with itself federally, and a premier who bought and sold a jet faster than most people actually return a bad Amazon order. I need something fun. I'm sure you need something fun. So let's close with Eddy's final cut, my genuinely, refreshingly positive take on the latest Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man Brand New Day, after this break. Welcome to Eddy's final cut. Marvel remembered how to make these movies, and somehow nobody told the editing bay. I want to open with something you almost never hear from me about a superhero movie in 2026, by the way. I actually had a genuinely great time watching this film, Spider-Man Brand New Day, which is Tom Holland's fourth outing as Peter Parker. Directed by Destin Daniel Cretton, also starring Zendaya, Sadie Sink, Jacob Batalon, and John Bernthal as the Punisher, as well as a cameo from Mark Ruffalo as the Hulk, and another cameo as Aunt May. Marissa Tomei is back as the aunt. 5 years after Peter asked Doctor Strange to erase his identity from the entire world's memory, including MJ and Ned, he's back. Nobody remembers him. And he has to rebuild every relationship he has from absolutely zero.
Hi, my name is Peter Parker. You don't remember me, but we used to know each other. Something bad was going to happen, and the only way to stop it was to make everyone forget about me. Because I'm not just Peter Parker. I'm Spider-Man.
90% on the critic meter, 98% with audiences. Verified hot on the popcorn meter, for anyone who doesn't obsessively track Rotten Tomatoes like apparently I do. That basically means the internet agreed on something for a change. And do you have any idea how rare that is? That's not hype. That's the consensus. Now here's what Marvel got it right. Tom Holland finally gets to play an adult. And I know what you're thinking. He's been a kid for so long that it's become unbelievable thanks to his age, right? He's definitely reached his early 30s by now. So he's not a kid in a suit making quips. He's actually playing a man carrying real grief in real isolation, trying to figure out who he is when the entire world has surgically edited to forget him. That premise alone is more emotionally interesting than half of the multiverse noise Marvel's been running on since Avengers Endgame. Zendaya's MJ doesn't even remember Peter, doesn't share his history, and yet through nothing but observation starts to clock that whoever this guy is, he might be a really good guy who might just be changing. And that's a literal quote from the movie. That's a hard note to land without dialogue doing all the work for you. She lands it. And John Bernthal's Punisher shows up and actually means something, unlike the cameo Jason Momoa made in Supergirl. There's also a scene where Frank Castle tells Peter that if he could bring his own lost people back for even 1 second, he wouldn't hide behind a mask to do it. That's the kind of line, by the way, that could be corny if it's delivered by the wrong person. But in this movie, it isn't. Cyclins, identity reconstruction. Trauma researchers call it identity reconstruction, when rebuilding who you are to the people around you after a major rupture. Peter isn't just fighting new villains in this movie. He's actually relearning his own relationships as a stranger would, which is genuinely rich metaphor for anyone who's ever had to rebuild trust after, let's say, a breakup, moving somewhere, or even getting a diagnosis. Marvel accidentally made a movie about starting over. And that's why it hits. And it hits hard emotionally as well. Now here's the major problem, because it's a really big problem. And here's my actual critique. And it's the same one that's dogged this franchise for quite a long time, actually. This movie cannot stop stuffing itself. I mean, There's a subplot about Peter developing new spider mutations that leads to some genuinely good scenes, and it doesn't just go anywhere. In fact, we see it for a good hour, and it doesn't go anywhere after that. There's also a telepathic villain who can hop between bodies, which is a great concept. But this film keeps splitting the focus between Peter's actual emotional arc versus an overarching Marvel Universe plotline that ends up serving another character more than Peter himself. And it's become to a point where I kept wondering if this is finally when we'll see Venom, because the focus is going away from him. And he's still developing these mutations. And then there are moments where the memory logic just doesn't fully track. How does recognition click back for one character, but not another? The movie never quite answers that question. It's a film that generally opens a dozen genuinely interesting doors, and then it, in true modern MCU fashion, by the way, jogs past half of them because, well, there's a franchise tie-in waiting in the next room, or maybe in the next few films. Cyclins, The Paradox of Choice, MCU edition. More options past a certain point don't improve an experience. They make it a lot harder to feel satisfied with a single one, because you're aware of everything you didn't get. Brand New Day has so much good material. The identity arc, the Punisher relationship between Spider-Man and the Punisher, the mutation subplot, the telepathic villain, and that no single thread gets the runway to fully have a concluding payoff. So it's not a bad movie because it has too little. It's a slightly frustrating one because it almost has too much. Now, on a fun side, can we actually talk about how Tom Holland, Jon Bernthal, and Zendaya were also in The Odyssey, which literally came out 2 weeks before this movie? It's the same actors, two different mythologies, in the same summer. Somewhere out there is a very confused casting directors group chat, by the way. And genuinely, somebody pointed out that Odysseus is basically the original Spider-Man, who's a guy with powers he didn't ask for, wearing a mask of sorts, desperately trying to get home to the people who used to know him, getting constantly interrupted by monsters, which is kind of a joke in itself. Homer basically wrote the pitch deck for this film 3,000 years way too early. He just forgot the web shooters. Also, by the way, Marissa Tomei's Aunt May is back from beyond the grave, and it's emotionally, not necromantically, by the way. Calm down. So here's my final verdict. I give it a 3.5 stars out of 5, and that's my number. Spider-Man Brand New Day is a genuinely mature, emotionally grounded Spider-Man movie wrapped inside Marvel's chronic inability to leave anything on the cutting room floor. Tom Holland finally gets the material worthy of 4 movies of build-up. Zendaya does more with restraint than most blockbusters do with a full script. The visuals are the best this suit has ever looked on screen. No assembly line gray wash here, by the way. It's actual color with vibrancy. But it's carrying at least one subplot, way too many, and a villain plotline that occasionally forgets whose movie this actually is. So go see it. Make sure you bring tissues for the Aunt May scenes, stay for the visuals and the post-credit scene, and then come argue with me about the mutation subplot, because I promise you, I'm definitely not done talking about it. And that's Eddy's Final Cut. I'm Eddy Kara, and this has been episode 204 of Real Talk with Eddy Kara. Take care of yourselves and of each other. Till next time.